Sarah glanced at the envelope that had arrived in the morning mail, a twinge of unease rising in her chest. The paper was yellowed, the handwriting unmistakably familiar, yet strange. She had recognized it the moment she laid eyes on it. "Don't trust the man in the hallway." She froze, her fingers trembling as she held the letter in her hand. The handwriting was that of her best friend, Emily. But Emily had been dead for over 2 years. A car accident, a tragic, senseless loss that had shattered Sarah's world. She sat down slowly, her pulse quickening as she opened the letter, her mind racing. It could not be real. It had to be some sick joke. Maybe someone who knew about Emily's death, someone who had wanted to torment her, was playing this cruel trick. But why? And why the reference to the man in the hallway? The letter was simple, the words few, but chilling. "Sarah, I know this may sound insane, but you need to trust me. There's someone in your hallway. He's watching you. He knows everything about you, about me. I couldn't explain it before, but I can now. Please, stay safe. Don't open the door for him. He's not who you think he is." The last words were scribbled hastily, as though Emily had been rushing to write them before something or someone had stopped her. A wave of nausea flooded Sarah's body. She tried to shake it off, tried to dismiss the thought that was creeping into her mind. But the truth was, nothing made sense anymore. Emily was gone. She'd been gone for so long, and yet, here was this letter, a message from beyond the grave. It wasn't just the letter that unsettled her. It was the way it had arrived. It was too precise, too perfect. She had lived in her small, quiet apartment since Emily's death, moving away from the house they had once shared. But in all that time, she had never received a letter. Emily had never sent anything like this before. She had always called or texted or sent emails, but never a letter. Not like this. And the message, the man in the hallway. Sarah stood up, pacing back and forth in her small living room. She tried to calm herself, to think logically. She couldn't let herself fall into some paranoid spiral, believing in things that weren't real. But the memory of that night, that strange occurrence when she had been at her apartment alone, when she had heard something or someone moving in the hallway, haunted her. The feeling of eyes watching her, the sensation of being followed even when she was alone. Was it just her imagination? Or had there been something more? Her mind raced through the events of the past few years. Ever since Emily's accident, Sarah had felt different. Like something in her life had been altered in a way she couldn't quite understand. The grief, the loss, had weighed so heavily on her that it was hard to focus on anything else. But even now, it wasn't just the grief that gnawed at her. It was the thought of the hallway, the strange, eerie feeling that never quite went away. Was there someone there? Was someone watching her? The apartment was quiet, too quiet. Sarah made her way to the hallway. The narrow corridor stretched in front of her, a long stretch of dimly lit walls leading to the front door. Her breath quickened, her mind playing tricks on her as she stepped forward, drawn to the shadows. She knew this hallway too well. It was the same one that had always given her the chills, the one she'd walked down countless times without giving it a second thought. But now, every inch of it seemed different. There was something about the silence that was suffocating, as though the very air itself was holding its breath. She stood in the middle of the hallway, staring down the stretch of the corridor. There was nothing out of the ordinary. No movement, no sounds. Just the quiet hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen, the distant murmur of traffic outside. But that didn't mean anything. She forced herself to move, pushing the thoughts of the letter from her mind. It was just a prank. That's all it was. She would be fine. But as she turned to walk back to her living room, she heard it. A faint knock, a soft tap against the door. Her heart skipped a beat, her feet frozen to the spot. She felt the coldness of the hallway creeping in around her, tightening its grip on her chest. The knock was gentle but persistent, echoing through the silence of her apartment. It was just the wind. It had to be. But the knock came again, and this time it was louder. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end. She wanted to turn and run, but her body refused to obey. She couldn't move, not with the thought of Emily's letter still lingering in her mind. Don't trust the man in the hallway. The words repeated over and over, like a mantra in her head. Slowly, Sarah took a step toward the door. Her hand shook as she reached for the handle, her mind clouded with fear. It could be anyone, a delivery person, a neighbor. But then again, no one ever came to her door. The knock had been so deliberate, so timed, like someone was waiting for her to answer. She stood in front of the door, her hand hovering over the doorknob. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized there was no peephole. There was no way to see who was on the other side. And then, the worst thought hit her. What if the man in the hallway wasn't outside? What if he was already in her apartment? She turned quickly, scanning every corner of the room. There was nothing, just the familiar clutter of her living space. The couch, the bookshelf, the coffee table. But something didn't feel right. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper, as though they were closing in on her. She thought she saw movement in the periphery of her vision, but when she turned, nothing was there. The knock came again, louder this time, shaking the door on its hinges. Her pulse quickened, her hands clammy with sweat. She couldn't ignore it anymore. She couldn't stay here, not with this feeling gnawing at her, pulling her toward the door. In a daze, Sarah reached for the handle, turning it slowly, fear crawling up her spine. She opened the door just a crack, enough to peer outside, but her heart stopped when she saw nothing. The hallway outside was empty, completely empty. She exhaled a breath she didn't realize she had been holding, feeling a momentary relief. But that relief was short-lived. Something was wrong. She could feel it in her gut. And then she saw him, standing at the far end of the hallway just at the edge of her vision, was a figure, a man, tall, shadowed, and almost featureless in the dim light. Her breath caught in her throat. She knew that face. She didn't have to see it clearly to recognize it. It was the same man who had haunted her dreams for years. The same man who had stood in her hallway, watching her, ever since Emily had passed. The man from her nightmares. He didn't move. He just stood there watching her with those cold, empty eyes. And in that moment, Sarah realized the truth. It wasn't just the hallway. It wasn't just the apartment. It wasn't just the letter. Emily hadn't been warning her about a man in the hallway. Emily had been warning her about something far worse. Something that had followed her into this life. The man in the hallway wasn't real. He was her. Sarah sat at her kitchen table, the letter still in her trembling hands. The words had been haunting her since the moment she had read them. The strange warning from Emily replaying in her mind, over and over. Don't trust the man in the hallway. Emily, her best friend, the person who had been there for her through everything, through the highs, the lows, the tears, and the laughter. The person who had been taken from her so suddenly, so violently. It felt like a lifetime ago, yet in a way, it felt like it had just happened yesterday. The letter didn't make sense. How could it? Emily was dead, gone, buried in the ground, her grave marked by a simple headstone, one Sarah had visited countless times, talking to her as though she were still there, as though her presence was still felt. But now, this letter, this impossibility, had appeared on her doorstep as if from thin air. Sarah's fingers gripped the edge of the envelope so tightly that they turned white. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to calm her racing heart. But it wasn't working. She felt the weight of the letter pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. There had to be an explanation. There had to be. She remembered the last time she saw Emily. It had been 2 years ago, just before the accident. They had spent the evening laughing, talking about everything and nothing, just like they always did. Emily had seemed so full of life, so vibrant, so normal. And then the call came in the middle of the night. The voice on the other end had been shaking, distant, as if the person delivering the news could hardly believe it themselves. Emily had been driving home after a late night out with friends. The weather had been bad, the roads slick with rain. A car had skidded out of control, slamming into hers head-on. The impact had been so severe that Emily had died instantly. The life she had just started to build, snatched away in the blink of an eye. Sarah had gone through the motions of grief, of shock, but it never felt real. It was as if she were watching herself from the outside, unable to comprehend what had happened. They had been so close. Emily had been her constant, her anchor, and now she was gone, leaving Sarah to navigate the world alone. But now, 2 years later, this letter had arrived. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The timing was too strange, too calculated. Emily wouldn't have sent a letter. Not like this. The last time they had communicated, it had been over the phone. A simple conversation about nothing important. Emily hadn't known she was going to die that night. She hadn't known the accident was coming. So how was this letter possible? She took a deep breath and forced herself to stand up, trying to push away the sense of dread that had settled in her stomach. She moved over to the kitchen counter and set the letter down, pacing around the small apartment. There was no way this could be real. No way Emily could have sent this after she was gone. But then again, if Emily hadn't written it, who had? Who would know about the man in the hallway? A chill ran down Sarah's spine as she thought about the hallway in her apartment. It was a narrow, dimly lit corridor, with walls painted a faded shade of beige. The kind of hallway that could easily be overlooked, but in the quiet moments, it felt as though the walls themselves were watching. And then, there were the dreams. The ones that had started after Emily died. Dreams of someone or something lurking in that hallway, waiting. Sarah had never been able to shake the feeling of eyes on her when she walked through it, like she wasn't alone. The hallway was always the same in the dreams, dim, silent, and cold. But it was the figure that stood there in the shadows that unsettled her the most. The man in the hallway. She couldn't remember his face, not clearly. It was always obscured in the darkness, just out of reach. But she remembered the sense of dread that accompanied his presence. The way he would watch her from the shadows, never moving, never speaking, just standing there. Every time she tried to turn away, he would still be there, as though he had always been. She could never escape him. And every time she woke up from the dream, Her heart would race, her body drenched in cold sweat, as though she had actually been standing there, facing him. But that had been just a dream, or so she had told herself. The letter, though, it made her question everything. Sarah took another deep breath and looked out the window. It was dark now, the sky a deep shade of black, with only a few stars visible through the clouds. The city below was quiet, the streets bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. It was peaceful, too peaceful. She turned back to the letter, staring at the messy handwriting. Emily had always written neatly, always so precise. But this was rushed, almost frantic. The letters seemed to be written in a hurry, the ink smeared in places as though Emily had written it in one sitting, as if she had known her time was running out. Could she have known something? Could she have known about the man in the hallway? Sarah's mind raced as she thought back to the few weeks before Emily's death. Had she ever mentioned anyone strange? Had she ever hinted at anything being wrong? Sarah couldn't remember. There had been nothing. Just normal, everyday conversations about work, relationships, and their shared plans for the future. Emily hadn't seemed like someone who was hiding something, someone who was afraid. But the letter made it clear that there had been something Sarah hadn't seen, something Emily hadn't been able to explain. She glanced back at the hallway, her gaze drawn to the darkened space that separated the living room from the front door. What was she supposed to do now? What was the meaning of this message? Was it a warning, a plea for help, or something else? She couldn't ignore it. Emily's words were etched in her mind, repeating with every passing moment. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in deeply, trying to calm herself. There had to be a way to make sense of all this. There had to be something. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that she couldn't stay in this apartment any longer. Not with the letter and the warning about the man in the hallway. She had to do something. She had to find out the truth. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest as she stepped closer to the door. Her fingers gripped the cool brass handle, trembling with a mix of fear and disbelief. The air in her apartment was thick with tension, the silence so heavy it felt as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. The hallway beyond the door remained still, but Sarah knew that something was wrong. The man from the letter, the one Emily had warned her about, was out there, just on the other side of the door. She could hear the faintest sound, like the scratching of nails against the floor. The noise came from somewhere in the darkness of the hallway, but it wasn't a natural sound. It was more like the scraping of something inhuman, a sound that sent chills down her spine. Her pulse quickened as she placed her hand on the doorknob, her body frozen for a moment, as if her instincts were warning her to turn away. But she couldn't. She had to know. Slowly, she turned the handle and pushed the door open, just a crack. The hallway stretched before her, dark and silent, with only the faintest glow of light spilling in from the living room behind her. But as she peered into the hallway, she saw nothing. No shadowy figure lurking in the distance. No man standing in the dark. It was empty. For a moment, Sarah felt a flicker of relief. Maybe the man was just a figment of her imagination, some trick her mind had played on her in her grief and fear. But then she heard it again, the scraping sound. Her breath caught in her throat as she stepped forward, her eyes scanning the hallway. Her heart was racing, the sound of her own pulse pounding in her ears. She could feel the tension in the air, the weight of it pressing down on her like a suffocating force. She hesitated for only a moment before stepping fully into the hallway, her eyes darting from side to side, searching for any sign of movement. The hallway seemed longer than she remembered, the shadows darker, the silence more oppressive. The faint sound of scraping continued, but now it was joined by something else, a low, almost inaudible whisper, like a voice carried on the wind. It was as if someone was speaking just beyond her hearing, the words twisted and unintelligible, a chorus of whispers that seemed to grow louder with every passing second. Sarah took another step forward, the floor creaking beneath her feet. Her body was tense, every muscle coiled with fear, but she couldn't turn back now. She had to know. She had to face whatever was in the hallway. And then she saw it, a shadow, darker than the rest, moving toward her from the far end of the corridor. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a trick of the light, a distortion in the air, but as it grew closer, she could see it more clearly. The figure was tall, thin, and unnaturally still, standing at the edge of the hallway like a statue. The man from her dreams. The man from the letter. Her breath caught in her throat as she took a step back, her body trembling. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but it seemed to draw closer, its presence pressing in on her, filling the space with an unbearable weight. She could feel its eyes on her, though she couldn't see them. There was something about the way it stood, something familiar, yet terrifying. Don't trust the man in the hallway. The words echoed in her mind, Emily's warning ringing in her ears like a broken record. But what did it mean? Who was he? And why was he here? The figure moved again, this time with a slow, deliberate step. Its presence was cold, like the air had suddenly dropped several degrees. The closer it got, the more Sarah felt like she couldn't breathe. It was as though the very air around her was being sucked away, leaving her suffocating in the dark. She could feel the walls closing in on her, the space growing smaller, more oppressive. And then it spoke, not in words, but in a sound that vibrated through her very bones. A low, guttural noise, like the growl of an animal, or the rumble of distant thunder. It was deep, ancient, and malevolent, filling her mind with a sense of overwhelming dread. Sarah's heart raced as the sound grew louder, more insistent, the whispers in the air growing in volume and intensity. She could feel the vibrations in her chest, in her head, in the very core of her being. The man was close now, so close that she could almost feel the coldness emanating from him, the darkness that clung to his every movement. He was almost on top of her, and she couldn't move. She was frozen in place, trapped in the hallway with this thing that had come for her. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure stopped. It was as if something had broken the connection, the strange force that had held her in place. The silence returned, but now it was thick and heavy, like the calm before a storm. Sarah's breath was shallow, her body shaking with the fear that had completely overtaken her. She knew she had to leave. She had to get out of the apartment, out of the hallway, away from whatever this thing was. But just as she turned to run, the man spoke again. Emily was wrong, he whispered, the words curling through the air like smoke, wrapping themselves around her mind. It was never about trust. Sarah stopped, her heart skipping a beat. The voice was not Emily's, but it was unmistakable. It was the same voice from the whispers, the same presence that had haunted her dreams. It was the man in the hallway, the one who had followed her all this time. She spun around, her eyes wide with disbelief. "What do you mean?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What do you want from me?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, it stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, like it was savoring every moment. Its presence was suffocating, the very air around it charged with an energy that made Sarah's skin crawl. She wanted to scream, wanted to run, but her legs refused to move. She was rooted to the spot, trapped in the darkness with this creature. And then, with a suddenness that made Sarah's blood run cold, the figure lunged at her,